So, good morning. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be part of your Mother's Day service. It's a beautiful morning, as Kenton mentioned. As the psalm reading reminded us, we live on an amazing planet. Author E.B. White once said, "Every morning, I awake torn between the desire to save the world and an inclination to savor it. This makes it hard to plan the day." So here we are on Mother's Day, celebrating the giving of life, that most sacred of acts. The sun is kind of shining. The trees are leafing out. You guys are ahead of us. In Red Lake, we're not very green yet, but we'll get there. If we're lucky, our children are nestled in our laps or beside us in the pew. Yet, incongruously, incredibly, unbelievably really, science is telling us that we are in the middle of a global emergency. 97% of climate scientists are convinced, based on the evidence, that human-caused global warming is happening. We lose 200 species every 24 hours to extinction. Our oceans are becoming so acidic from the extra carbon dioxide that the ocean water is starting to take the shell out of shellfish. Instead of the innumerable living things, both great and small, that the psalmist described, our oceans are on the verge of turning into a sea of weeds. Extreme weather events are impacting more and more people every year. Disproportionately, the global poor, because they already live on the margins and have no cushion when the rains don't come or the floods destroy their crops. But it's not just the poorest among us. The 2013 Calgary flood was the most expensive natural disaster in Canadian history, and the Toronto flood, which came shortly after, was the most expensive natural disaster in Ontario's history. So we are the first generation to feel the effects of human-caused global warming, and the last generation to be able to stop it. Yet, for the most part, it remains tucked back on page 27 of the newspaper. Global warming is a problem that is very difficult for us to wrap our minds around. Our brains develop to focus on more immediate dangers. Is this tiger going to eat me? Global warming is a vague, amorphous, sort of future threat. It can't be easily felt, or seen, or even easily described. A recent study took a group of people and divided them in half. Half of the group spent some time in a room that was slightly above room temperature, not that warm, like 27 degrees. The other half was in a room temperature room, like we're in now. Afterwards, each group was asked if climate change was real. More people in the warm room said yes. Yes. So we can't rely on our own experience on this issue. We need to listen to the experts. And they are very, very alarmed. Not by climate change itself, because there are solutions and there have been solutions for over a decade, but by the general apathy of the population, sometimes even hostility, and the resulting lack of political will to act on this issue. It's interesting on Mother's Day to note that research suggests parents with young children are less likely to believe in climate change, that it's a serious threat, and less likely to talk about it. And they are significantly less likely to have an opinion on how to deal with it. If only we had an enemy we could pin climate change on. If North Korea was found to be pouring climate-altering chemicals into the air to increase frequency and severity of floods, droughts, and wildfires across North America, there would be pretty swift and decisive action. So let me help put some faces on this faceless emergency. Brenda is about my age, a young grandmother living in Fort McKay First Nation in the epicenter of the Alberta oil sands boom. There's no clean water in the community anymore. Every day, bottled water is delivered to households. On my visit to Fort McMurray a few years ago, Brenda shared with me her sadness that her grandchildren couldn't swim in the lake in front of her house anymore. If they do, they break out into rashes and sometimes open sores. Then there's my friend Mark. He lives in San Diego, and his favorite childhood memories involve eating fruit, stealing fruit off of his neighbor's trees. So for 20 years, he's been planting fruit trees in his backyard in anticipation of grandchildren who could experience eating a fruit picked fresh off a tree. One of his favorite trees produced big purple plums that when you bit into them, the juice runs down your chin and down your arm. About 4 years ago, the tree stopped producing plums. And when Mark brought in a branch to his local nursery, he was told there wasn't anything he could do. San Diego's winters aren't cold enough anymore for the tree to go through its natural cycle. It will never produce plums for Mark's grandchildren. A South African delegate to UN climate talks in 2012 told the assembled delegates, "My ancestral lands are going to go through a 4 to 5 degree increase even if the world stops at 2 degrees. Grass stops growing at 38 degrees and our cattle will die. So whatever we have managed to preserve through genocide and colonization, we're going to lose through climate change. As an Indigenous person, when I lose my land, I lose my culture. I am sorry about your recession, but I'm experiencing a bit of compassion fatigue. Father, forgive us, for we know not what we do." As Christians, we are called to love our neighbors, not to flood their homes and destroy their crops, but to love them. We are called to be stewards of God's magnificent creation, not to pollute it and destroy it for future generations. Because global warming is, a global issue, it can be overwhelming. And we can get caught in the different stages of grief: denial, anger, depression. All of those are paralyzing. I know. The final stage is acceptance linked to action. Action that is not based on our chances of success, because they're pretty daunting right now, but rather on our obligation to action. So what can one person or one church do? I'm glad you asked. Number 1, break the silence. This is a global catastrophe that nobody is talking about. Resolve to speak to at least one new person every day about climate change. And remember, 97% of climate scientists are convinced, based on the evidence, that human-caused global warming is happening. 2, pray daily about climate change and ask for guidance on this issue, and then allow for space and quiet to listen for the answer. There will be one. 3, make space in your church community for grieving and lamenting what we have already lost, and for our thoughtlessness and desecration of God's creation. What Steve Heinrichs did last month on the grounds of CMU is an example of this. Number 4, the movement to divest from fossil fuels is doing important work. we should all be looking at our own and our organization's portfolios. Number 5, the single most impactful action you can take to create the political will for a livable world is to sit down with your member of parliament and talk about your concerns, preferably with other climate-concerned constituents, and offer solutions, and keep going back. What being part of Citizens Climate Lobby, which I've been part of for the last 5 years, has taught me is that politicians do not create political will, they respond to it. Citizens Climate Lobby is modeled on the example of Gandhi's Truth Force, what he called Satyagraha, that propelled the British out of India. Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers focus on building relationships of respect and ongoing dialogue with elected officials, all elected officials. My own MP is Greg Rickford, Minister of Natural Resources, and we meet with him regularly. We just met with him 2 weeks ago. We at CCL are a persistent, loving, and peaceful army that lobbies specifically for a price on carbon emissions as the single most important mechanism to shift our economy away from fossil fuels. Love it or hate it, the market economy is the single most powerful social force in human history. An honest price on carbon would harness the market to solve the climate crisis and unleash its creativity at the same time. Climate scientist Dr. Catherine Hayhoe says, as Christians, we are told that God is not the author of fear. God is love. When we are acting out of fear, we are thinking about ourselves. When we act out of love, we are thinking about others, our global neighbors, the poor and disadvantaged, the people who don't have the resources to adapt. So I believe we're first of all to love each other, and second of all, to act. During the Apollo mission in 1969, astronaut Rusty Schweickart was let out of the capsule on an umbilical cord. Usually NASA keeps the astronauts compulsively busy up there, but a peculiar thing happened to Schweickart. Just as he emerged from the capsule, something went wrong inside. Both mission control in Houston and the remaining astronauts had to concentrate on the problem. This left Rusty all alone, floating around Mother Earth in complete cosmic silence. During this time, Rusty had 2 profound conversion experiences. He looked back on Mother Earth, a shining gem against a totally black backdrop, and realized everything he cherished was on that gem. His family and land, music and human history with its folly and its grandeur. He was so overcome that he wanted to hug and kiss that gem like a mother does her firstborn child. Compassion flowed through him. Trained as a jet fighter pilot, he was a typical macho man, but a breakthrough of something bigger came washing over him at that moment in space. Schweikart's second awakening was a political one. He was a red, white, and blue American who believed what he had always been taught, that the world was divided between the communist world and the free world. Yet, while floating around Mother Earth, he saw that rivers flowed indiscriminately between Russia and Europe, that ocean currents served communist, socialist, and capitalist nations alike, that clouds did not stop at borders to test for political ideology, and that there are no nations. Nations exist in the mind of the human race alone. On returning to NASA, Schweickart was not debriefed by any spiritual director about his mystical experience. He confesses to having wandered about in a state of stupor for 6 months, bumping into walls while asking himself repeatedly this one question: why did God do this to me? Finally, he concluded God did this through him so that others might hear the message. What message? Compassion, interdependence, shared beauty on this shining, glistening planet. The holy earth, we must take such care of it. It must take such care of us. This side of heaven, we are each of us so nearly all the other has. There is darkness all around us. Yet between us, there is just enough light to get by.